It's kind of crazy to think about, but in these strange modern times, fantasy is undeniably cool now. It's gone from being a social liability in middle school to an absolute beast of a moneymaker, seen everywhere from mainstream TV to video games. But how did we get here in the first place? Do you remember your first encounter with dragons, elves, or magic? And it's all got me thinking, what was most people's gateway drug, if you will, to epic fantasy? Well, I think for many, that would have to be none other than the inheritance cycle. Love it or hate it, and believe me, people really love it or hate it, this series was a massive success that has led to a surprisingly long-lasting series. Now, it had been a while for me since I read the first books back in middle school, and I was kind of shocked to find when I was dipping my toes back into the fandom, everything from die-hard fans to people screaming at the top of their lungs that the entire thing is plagiarized and needs to be burned to the ground immediately. But despite all of the highs and lows, the inheritance cycle has remained relevant, with actually a shockingly large amount happening with the series in recent years. So in this video, I'm going to explore the history of the series, address the criticism that has followed it, and finally see where everything is at today to explore whatever happened to Eragon. Hi everyone, my name is Otto, and welcome to Exits Examined. We'll be exploring series, franchises, and more after their prime time has seemingly come to an end. If that sounds good to you, there's a like and subscribe button below. The best way to describe the premise of Eragon is actually pretty simple. Imagine your favorite RPG, maybe something like Skyrim. It's been out almost a decade now, and you've played thousands of hours, max level, all the best gear, all the best mounts, maybe you've even installed some mods. Now imagine that your monstrosity of a player character has taken over the world and is bored out of his mind. Well, that's Galbatorix, the big bad of the inheritance cycle. Okay, so let's back up a minute. Basically, Galbatorix betrayed and overthrew the Dragon Riders who had held the world in peace for generations. The Riders, though, are much more than just their name implies. They're actually extremely powerful beings who formed a strong bond with their dragons and have enormous magical powers and super sweet swords. So if you're unfamiliar with the setting, you can basically just imagine Jedis riding dragons. In this setting, we find Eragon, a young farmer in a small village who finds a strange egg in the woods, which, plot twist, turns out to be the last free dragon, who he names Saphira. The egg had been guarded by the Varden, the last rebel group opposing Galbatorix's tyrannical rule. Speaking of Galbatorix, my man really wants his eggs. Anyway, his forces murder Eragon's adopted family in pursuit of it, but fortunately for Eragon, the local storyteller Brom is secretly the last surviving dragon rider. Under Brom, Eragon learns the arts of combat, magic, and all about the old dragon riders. With this newfound knowledge, he fully immerses himself in the rebellion, encountering diverse races, navigating complex political landscape, and all that good epic fantasy adventure stuff. So yes, some of the more keen-eyed among you might already be noticing the eerie similar beats here as in other media. But hold on, we'll get to all of that later because I think leaving the premise there would be a bit of a disservice because there's a surprisingly rich and deep world here. So the setting here is Allegasia, and it's got all of your favorites, from your mountainy dwarves to your foresty, aloof elves, and of course your dirty, messy humans wrecking the place for everyone. We even have our own versions of orcs running around called Urgles. Now, I know on the surface level, all this sounds pretty familiar, been there, done that, but if you dig a bit deeper, there are actually some really interesting nooks and crannies in this world. Take the elves, for example. They're a bit more brutal than your typical elf fare, and their forest reflects this by being a pine forest instead of your average leafy one. Same with the Urgles. Instead of just being pure evil creatures, they're actually given a layer of nuance and a surprisingly deep culture. The magic system is another great example, which is essentially more the art of thinking than anything else. So by focusing on these shared properties, you could turn something like a gemstone into water, but there are limitations and pretty clearly defined rules and limits. Aside from that, there are some really interesting and unique additions to the world that really do make it feel special, with some of my personal favorites being the Nightwalls, these giant intelligent sea snakes, and werecats, which are exactly what you think they are. And in the world, they're very mysterious and thought to be a myth, but then end up playing a much larger part in the story. Even the language of the worlds are surprisingly fleshed out, and there are entire sections in the back of each book providing translations for the languages spoken by the elves, dwarves, dwarves, and even Urgles. Now, of course, you can have as rich and interesting of a setting as possible, but it's nothing without some characters to mess everything up. Well, interestingly enough, apparently the inheritance cycle was originally going to be a story split between three half-brothers, Eragon, Roran, and Murtagh. Now, I've already mentioned Eragon, but as far as MCs, he's actually pretty interesting because you really feel his growth. He starts as this kind of whiny, maybe overzealous, naive kid to saddling a massive responsibility and really growing into his role. You can really feel his power level increase with each book, and you get the sense that he's aware of this as well as the responsibilities that come with it. Even at the height of his power, we still see a ton of his doubts, and you get the sense that he's a thinker. He overanalyzes everything, which is really nicely balanced out by his dragon Saphira, who more often than not would just say something along the lines of, "Yo, let's stop thinking, let's just go kill people." Saphira is awesome, and you can tell that she must have been a ton of fun to write. She's this really cool mix of an ancient, graceful, near-extinct creature with wisdom passed down through her regal ancestors and a giant cat that knows she's the boss of her human. But as this is an epic, sprawling adventure, there are a ton of other characters here, and they do not disappoint. Eragon's best friend from his village, Roran, starts as this average guy and turns into a high-ranking commander in the rebellion. Eragon's love interest, the elf Arya, seems to start as a damsel in distress with a very detached demeanor, but eventually morphs into having her own agency and personality that really shines through in moments. And I love the scenes where we and Eragon start to see these little cracks showing in her personality, like the thrill and exhilaration she gets from battle or her dancing before Murtagh and Thorn have to go and ruin everything. And it's good that we have all these characters because, make no mistake, this is a grand story with a ton packed in here. Complex politics, strategy, prophecy, it's all in here, but probably at the core, it's your classic hero's journey and a coming-of-age tale. Beyond that, the books do raise a lot of questions about morality, when violence is justified, even if some threads do seem to be lost in the shuffle, like Eragon becoming vegetarian, then kind of dropping it a bit randomly. And most of the time, the books take these themes in some really interesting places. Okay, so heads up, spoilers for the next 30 seconds. The ending in particular was a huge standout. Instead of your typical epic sword fight, fighting Galbatorix was more of a puzzle because his power levels were Dragon Ball Z levels off the chart, and I think the way it resolved did feel all the more satisfying for it. Then there was the actual ending with a ton of people feeling robbed of Eragon and Arya being a thing, so TT Aryagon, I guess. Okay, I can't believe I said that. Anyway, quickly moving on, there's this feeling of bittersweetness, maybe not tragedy at the end, but there is nuance in the ending. Even though at the end the big bad is defeated, there's still issues in the world, and these are arguably more complicated and less black and white. Okay, so as far as the mainline series goes, this isn't some Warriors-esque billion-book series. It's actually quite manageable, even if the books themselves were pretty thick by YA standards. We had Eragon in 2003, Eldest in 2005, Brisingr in 2008, and finally Inheritance in 2011. Now, I know some of you are probably screaming at me already because I haven't mentioned one of the most important parts about the series. Now, it's impossible to talk about Eragon without talking about its author, Christopher Paolini. One of Eragon's biggest selling points all the way back in 2003 was Christopher, who famously was just 19 at the time, and in fact, he holds the Guinness World Record for the youngest best-selling author. Now, this can be a bit confusing because you'll see some people saying he wrote it and published it anywhere between 14 and 16, so let me clear this all up. When Christopher began writing Eragon at 15, it underwent extensive revisions over 2 years before his parents self-published it. And yeah, his family did all the marketing themselves, essentially selling the book out of their car at school events, and the family went through a period of pretty difficult financial time, so this was not a sure thing that the book would become big. Well, through a lot of luck, a writer by the name of Carl Heisen, who himself is quite famous, was vacationing in one of the areas that Christopher's family had toured. He bought Eragon for his stepson to read, and they loved it so much that he had to pick it up himself and realized that there was really something here. So he brought the book to the attention of Random House, who thought Eragon and Christopher's story was a good combination for financial success and wanted to cash in. Now, you'll see a ton of people saying that the writing improves as the series progresses, and this brings me quite nicely to my next point. Although the age definitely made a good selling point, I do not think it would be fair to say that it's all been positive. So the real reason that talking about the series has been so controversial is that much of the discourse that has surrounded it over recent years has been around how it's derivative, unoriginal, and outright plagiarism. Now, this is a tricky conversation to come into because it delves into the trickier and murkier waters of influences versus stealing. So I'm going to try to do my best to present the criticisms and counter-arguments in as unbiased view as possible. I'm sure some people will disagree with some things I will say, but hopefully we can have a nice civil discourse, which is of course what the internet is known for. So essentially, criticisms of everything from stealing plot points / scenes to outright plagiarism has dogged the series. Now, the most obvious comparisons have been, of course, Star Wars and Lord of the Rings, or more precise, Star Wars but in the Lord of the Rings settings. So let me break down the premise of the first book one more time to explain. Eragon leads a quiet life in a remote village, which is shattered when he stumbles upon a dragon egg from an elven princess who is fighting with a rebel group to overthrow the evil empire. A mysterious older Brahm becomes Eragon's mentor, guiding him in the ancient art of dragon riding, a skill long forgotten by most. Their peaceful existence is abruptly ended when the enemy attacks their home in search of the egg. Forced to leave behind his familiar world, Eragon embarks on a perilous journey to fulfill his destiny as a dragon rider and eventually rescues the princess. In a heartbreaking sacrifice, Brahm gives his life to ensure their escape. So yeah, there you go. As far as Lord of the Rings, most people tend to note the similarity in setting, languages, and world building, with people frequently bringing up the dwarves and elves as examples. But beyond that, people bring up many other series that the inheritance cycle has seemingly taken note from. These include the bond between dragon and rider, as well as how they communicate from the Dragon Riders of Pern series. Then Ursula K. Le Guin's magic system from the Incredible Earthsea series is often compared to the one in Inheritance Cycle. After recently delving deep into both series, I can understand where people are coming from, but I do think Christopher ultimately takes the concept in a different direction. Finally, another one that frequently gets brought up is the Belgariad series, with some scenes being very similar to those in the Inheritance Cycle. So speaking about Belgariad actually brings us quite nicely to the counter arguments. So it's no secret that Christopher has admired the Belgariad series, and he pretty openly talks about how influential it was, and all can be boiled down more to homage rather than plagiarism. Another one is that the Inheritance Cycle's world and world building, while may not be extremely unique, is its own. The elves, for example, in lack of a better word, are, let's just say, pointy, aka bloodthirsty and occasional massacre generators. In a similar vein, his portrayal of dwarves is quite a bit different too, with even an emphasis on strong, independent, hot dwarf ladies, which about time. Another defense of Eragon is that fantasy as a genre is inherently derivative. Criticizing Christopher for using established tropes is unfair because those elements exist for a reason. They resonate with readers. So basically, if we canceled every story that follows the hero's journey, what would we even be left with? Christopher, like many authors, draws inspiration from his contemporaries, and there's nothing wrong with that. Finally, the series is meant to be a gateway drug to fantasy. Many of these concepts will be new and fresh, and there's nothing wrong with that because other fantasy books can be intimidating, and this is something of a stepping stone. So anyway, to go back to the other side of the negative pendulum for a moment, you'll also see people criticize the writing itself, specifically of the earlier books, so how bloated some things can get and the overuse of some words, like a really strange fixation with the word cacophony. People will also cite the characterization of Eragon as inconsistent. A good example is Eragon in Eldest. He decides to stop eating meat after his training with the elves, though in the next book he's killing soldier after soldier no problem. Also, some people have thought some scenes were a bit cringe, in lack of a better word, with some of the poetry being a prime example, and I was personally kind of raising eyebrows when Roran killed 193 people in one go, which seems over the top because he's just a regular human, but maybe I'm just mad because there's no way he did more than my guy Guts. In a way though, I'm happy that the topic of plagiarism is brought up because it does bring up some more interesting questions of the line between inspiration and stealing, which is especially interesting in a trope like genre like fantasy. Now, this entire conversation reminds me of a quote by Mark Twain, that there's basically no such thing as originality, or as another saying goes, steal one idea and you're a criminal, but steal 100 and you're a genius. So I think the question really boils down to where the line is, and to be honest, I'm not sure, and I'd be really curious to know what other people think. Because obviously, on one hand, we can't have people stealing entire books, but on the other hand, fantasy wouldn't be where it is today without people borrowing similar tropes and ideas from one another. Now, personally, I can't help but wonder how much of this boils down to the age of Christopher. When you see people mention these things about plagiarism or writing style, the age almost always comes up in the discussion. Now, I always wonder how reception would have been different if it was published under a pen name, or if the stories wouldn't have even gotten off the ground in the first place. But speaking of Christopher, I think you can't deny that he's extremely passionate about the series, and it's clear he has a ton of his own ideas and inspirations if you listen to his interviews. I also love that he's actually pretty active on Reddit and even calls people out. Now, I think a lot of this criticism was further intensified by the adaptations, and boy, oh boy, the adaptations. You know it's bad when the author himself pretends like it doesn't exist. So the movie, released in 2006, received a 16% on Rotten Tomatoes. I think if the movie was released with another title, like outside the Eragon universe, it would have been your standard fantasy fair movie. But as an adaptation, it really doesn't hold up because there were a ton of deviations from the books, both big and small. Now, this isn't necessarily a bad thing because, books are a different medium and you have to change it to fit the format. But even as a movie itself, people tend to cite the stale acting and the general just weird stuff happening in the movie. For example, Saphira growing up in a matter of seconds. It also feels, I hate to say it, but generic and cheap. Nothing really feels distinctive or fresh, and even worse, it doesn't really highlight any of the aspects that make the Eragon series unique and what makes it special. Another huge criticism of the movie was the rushed nature of the story, so no real character development, particularly between Eragon and Saphira, which was really at the core of the books. Now, this makes a lot of sense because the movie is so limited as far as time, and it probably would have been much better as a TV series. Going a step further though, none of the quality is particularly surprising when you realize that the director of the film was a special effects artist with almost no directing experience, and after this film he must not have liked it because he went straight back to visual effects. So this adaptation died a pretty quick death, with most fans having a long-running joke that the movie just doesn't exist. As far as Christopher, this is what he's had to say. Quote, "I'm very grateful that a film adaptation was made because very few books are ever adapted as film. And also the movie interested many new readers to the series, which I think is a good thing. I gave as much input as possible on the film as it was being made, but ultimately the film represents the filmmaker's version of the story, as it should, of course. And the books represent my vision of the story, and people are free to enjoy both of them on their own terms." As a side note to the film, there was a video game adaptation tie-in, but unfortunately this was also nothing to write home about, with kind of repetitive gameplay and a general lack of depth, which makes sense because it was probably rushed out in time for the film. Now, this is a shame because there probably is a good game to be made with the source material. I'm personally convinced an open world game where you fly around on Saphira would be so much fun. Another important thing to mention here is that there were different versions of this game for different platforms. Now, I know some of you are saying, yeah, well, duh, but these versions actually can be radically different. The Xbox version had 2 entirely unique levels, and the Game Boy Advance, PSP, and mobile versions are effectively different games, with the Game Boy Advance version basically being an RPG. Now, fortunately for fans, there was also some other releases during this time, including Eragon's Guide to Allegatia in 2009, between Brissinger and Inheritance. This is filled with absolutely gorgeous images of the world and has some excellent additions such as letters and mementos. I've always had a special place in my heart for in-universe additions to series like this, and the book does this really well, with the idea that it puts you in the role of a new writer, with Eragon unable to personally mentor you due to his commitment, so he's created this guide to kind of aid you in your training. If that's not enough for you, there's also been an official Eragon coloring book that actually has some great drawings in it. There's also been a smattering of deluxe, collector, and special editions released from the mainline series, and these include a number of different editions like maps, guides, and entirely new passages and chapters. Okay, so this all brings us to the current day, and you might think to yourself, after a pretty awful adaptation, this series might have stopped. Well, actually, if anything, it looks like it's picking up steam. In 2018, a collection of 3 short stories called The Fork, the Witch, and the Worm was released. Now, this isn't anything like a fully realized novel, but the stories are nice little charming additions with a few glimpses at some of the main characters, from Eragon, Murtagh, and even the herbalist Angela. This is very much a companion book though, with a ton of major players not even in it, and one section written by Christopher's sister. Okay, so remember how I said one of those stories focused on Murtagh? Well, at the end, there was still a ton of unanswered questions. Thankfully, these were finally addressed in the 2023 release of Murtagh. Now, this was a honest-to-goodness sequel to The Inheritance Cycle, and a crucial piece of world building, with Christopher himself saying, quote, "Murtagh is the novel I've been waiting to write for over 13 years. Now, this one focused, as you might expect by the title, on Murtagh and Thorn, really fleshing out their character and their backstory, which is great because they were some of the most interesting and mysterious characters in the original series. Now, very mild spoilers here, the book can kind of be broken into two major parts. Some people have criticized the second half for being a little slow, and not to give too much away, but a bit too graphic. Now, there was a direct sequel planned, but at this point the jury is still out on if it'll be a short story, another full-length novel, or POV chapters in a potential future book. And oh yeah, there are future books planned. And this really is looking like it could potentially be the start of an entirely new line of books. Now, the biggest of these that we know about is not very creatively known as Book Number 6 by fans. Confusingly and hilariously enough, it was previously known as Book 5 until Murtagh was released, but basically it is a confirmed follow-up to The Inheritance Cycle, and we know this is a thing because Christopher himself has addressed why he needed to release Murtagh before Book 6, saying, quote, "I realized that a certain amount of groundwork needed to be laid in place before the book would make sense. Murtagh is that groundwork, and there was no way I could move on to Book 6 without writing this story first." And in regards to the plot, quote, "Everyone in Allegasia has overlooked something really important with regards to the new peace they hope to establish." Now, there were a number of unanswered threads from the original series, so the world really is ripe for new ideas. Also, it should be noted that Christopher has finished the global map of the worlds of Eragon, which strongly implies that Book 6 and beyond will have a significant component of the action taking place outside of Allegasia. However, there has been no release date on this yet. Aside from that, there have been a smattering of other releases that have been hinted at in the near future, including Murtagh Deluxe Edition and an illustrated edition of Eldest. There have also been others teased, including Tales from Allegasia Volume 2, an unnamed story about a dwarf detective, and even a tabletop RPG, which I would love to see, although I'd have to work hard to find people near me to play it. Christopher, though, does seem to love to tease his fans because he's dropped hints at everything from a prequel about Brahm to a Baby Saphira picture book, which again, I would love to see. But speaking of all these teases, this all pales in comparison to the biggest tease of them all, the TV show. And yes, there is a TV show. Now, allegedly, this was all sparked through a Discord group with some coordination and pre-planning that Christopher participated in, culminating with him tweeting #Eragon Remake in an effort to get Disney to revamp the book series into a possible TV show for Disney+. Within hours, the hashtag began to trend, with fans pushing for a proper adaptation, and things got off the ground. In 2022, it looked like everything was going well, with Christopher himself saying that he would be the co-writer on the series, which is a great sign. Now, there has seemingly been a few starts and stops in production during the whole writer's strike, but good news is that there seems to be movement on this now, with Christopher actually starting to give concrete timelines and confirming it will be live action, saying, quote, "Although it's really expensive to do live action because the catering bill for feeding the dragons on set is just sky high." Now, obviously, opinion on recent works of Disney are divided to say the least, and in fact, one of the worst adaptations I've seen was sadly from Disney with Artemis Fowl, so it remains to be seen if Disney can make this one worthwhile, but hopefully between them learning from their mistakes and Christopher's involvement, it can finally be the adaptation that this series deserves, and if it's handled right, I can definitely see this becoming big. There is a huge audience for it. So that all being said, it looks like the state of the series is going pretty strong. Christopher is putting a ton of effort and energy into the series, constantly doing tours, giving interviews, writing new books, and with a good amount of new releases on the horizon and the possibility of a show, we could very easily be on the verge of the series exploding in popularity. So here we are in 2024, and not only are we still talking about the Eragon series, but it seems poised to possibly be making something of a comeback. And it's all got me wondering how this series has had such remarkable staying power. Well, I'm sure everyone has their own reasons, but it's clear that Eragon served as a gateway to fantasy for many. Fantasy can be really intimidating for people wanting to dip their toes in for the first time. I mean, I remember looking at my brother's Wheel of Time books and just not believing my eyes at how many books and how many pages there were. Now, Eragon and the Inheritance Cycle was something of an accessible entry point. Sure, there may be tropes, but these can actually be really helpful for easing people into the setting or genre. Whether you're a longtime fan or highly critical of it, Eragon introduced an entire generation to epic fantasy, and we can still feel the impact of this as fantasy enjoys unprecedented levels of popularity, and I just love that it's series like this that have helped it become what it is today. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate all the support as I'm getting this channel off the ground. I want to give a massive and special shout out to ibid11962, who is truly one of the goats of the Eragon community and helped me tremendously with fact checking and other info. As always, a gigantic thank you to my patrons. You guys rock. If you want to do more to support me, please check out my Patreon link in the description below. As always, if you have any suggestions about what you want me to cover next, it's really cool to hear what you have to say. Thanks again. I'll see you next time. Bye.